Welcome to Engage ICT. I'm Sarah Jane Crespo. There are a lot of education-related topics before the legislature this year, some of which will have significant impacts, but they aren't all making headlines. Tonight, we'll talk about what's going up for a vote and what impact we may see after the legislature gets through this year's agenda. On our panel tonight, we have KMUW education reporter Suzanne Perez, Assistant Executive Director of Advocacy at the Kansas Association of School Boards, Leah Fliter, and Head of Schools at the Independent School, Terrell Davis. Thank you for joining us. Let's have a round of applause for our panel. I want to start with an overview of last year's legislation because I think a lot of what happened last year has just flowed into this year in a way that doesn't always occur. Suzanne, can you summarize what passed and what didn't, and kind of just how all of that set us up for what's going on this year?
Sure. One thing to note, I think most importantly, is that education is the biggest part of the state budget by far. So anytime the legislature looks at budget, education is the biggest part of that. So last year, for the first time really in a number of years, schools, at least regular ed funding for schools, is at the appropriate level. Schools are fully funded, and you'll hear Governor Laura Kelly say that a lot on the on the trail. But one thing that did not get funded at the level it's supposed to be is special ed funding. So a big thing that's carrying over to this legislative session is a push to fund special education at the level that the law requires, really. So the state is supposed to fund special ed at 92% of excess cost. It now funds it at about 70%. It's a huge battle, a huge campaign by Leah and others to get that level to its appropriate level.
Can you just explain briefly what that means, funding at excess cost,
okay.
Did you say?
So when you think about, there's a per pupil, the per pupil average funding for a student in Kansas is around, $5,000 now. A special needs student will cost sometimes exponentially higher than that, depending on their needs. Public schools educate everyone. The difference in what it takes to educate a regular ed, the difference between the per pupil funding and what it takes to educate, to offer programs to those special ed kids is the excess costs. So it's worth noting too that the federal government doesn't pull its fair share either, and that's a big battle. So that's a huge issue that's carried over. The other thing is some school choice measures. So last year, one school choice, sort of limited school choice measure that did pass was an open enrollment bill, and that allows it's going into effect in the fall of 2024, so next school year. But that will essentially allow students to attend any public school district they choose within very set limits. So school districts are going to be able to set their capacity limits for certain grade levels. But if I'm, say, living near Andover schools, but I'm in the Wichita School District and I want to send my child to Andover schools, I could apply to go to Andover schools, and if they have the capacity, if they set their capacity limit and say, we can take 20 third graders, then I can apply, and then there would be for my child, and then there would be a lottery for those kids. So that passed. We'll talk about other school choice measures later in the program, I'm sure. And then other things that passed last year but didn't really get through were a parental bill of rights. So there's lots and lots of efforts across the country for parental Bill of Rights measures. One that passed through the legislature was, essentially declaring that parents have the right to guide their child's education, and then it would also give them some special powers over curriculum and to oppose certain materials they find offensive. That passed through the State House, but it was vetoed by Governor Kelly, and then they fell short on the veto, on overriding the veto. So that's kind of a little wrap up.
Okay, and we'll get into all of those topics in more detail momentarily. Terrell, I want to come to you next. You've had a long career in education, first in public school and now at a private school, of course, independent. Can you talk about how the ways we educate our children have shifted over time?
This is my 26th year, so I feel like I'm becoming the old guy in education. I think things have changed in that, we really focus on the student and making sure that it's a hands-on curriculum. We're competing with all the modern technology that kids have now. And so making sure that those technologies are inside the classroom, but that we're teaching kids how to be responsible for those technologies, as well as being just good citizens with those technologies. I think the other piece is really exploring the career field and making sure that kids are exposed to different opportunities so that they can make the best educational decision for themselves as they're going into a 4-year institution or a 2-year institution, or even going into the career field after high school. And so really targeting those opportunities for exposure for our students. Then the big thing is making sure that all kids learn and that we're not leaving anyone behind, if you will. We heard the phraseology, no child left behind, but really focusing on every student learning to the best of their ability and making sure that they all are set up for success, and really just cherishing our kids. And then coming out of COVID, making sure that we're addressing any kind of learning gaps that are there. Whether you're in public school or private school, kids are dealing with the effects of COVID. And whether those are social issues, whether those are just sitting in a classroom for 45 minutes to an hour, or if there's just those learning gaps because they missed a year of learning, of actual learning, if they were online or distance learning, and really filling in those holes, because we can't leave those kids out there with these holes there in their education.
Can you add just a little bit about what current methods are being utilized to do that catch up after COVID?
Well, you have, your intervention programs that are early and often, and all schools, whether they're private or public, should be always evaluating those interventions, making sure they're being effective. If not, looking at your frequency or your intensity of the intervention, looking at the effectiveness of that intervention. It may be a reading program for one kid. It may be a phonics program for another kid. It could be a whole language program for a different kid. And so really tailoring those intervention programs to the individual kid's needs, so that, again, you've got to set those goals, but you got to find the right program for the right kid. It's not a one-size-fit-all, and I think that's part of the fallacy for non-educators, if you will, or legislators sometimes, is they think if you just put this program in, every kid is going to learn. Well, that one program may meet 70% of your students, but there may be another 30 that need something a little bit more intense or a little bit something different for them. And so I think it is the trick, if you will, or the goal of the educator, to find the different programs for kids and make sure you have a robust intervention programs for those students. Also, extended day learning opportunities where school's over at 3 o'clock, but there's learning opportunities till 5 o'clock in the evening, as well as extended year. So we're having programs in the summertime, and you've got to make them fun, but they've got to be educational. Because again, we're filling in those gaps of that COVID year, those COVID 2 years. And so that extended day, extended school year is important to those students.
Very good. Leah, let's come to you. Can you bring us up to speed on what's been happening in the legislature so far this session?
Sure. Mostly what we've seen so far, Sarah Jane, except for a late development today, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes, is a little more of a focus on what you might call some of the more social issues or hot button issues. You mentioned the Parents' Bill of Rights that did pass the legislature last year. It was very prescriptive, required teachers to post their lesson plans well in advance, and post all kinds of things that parents could challenge, every book in the library, that type of thing. And that is the bill that Suzanne referred to that was vetoed by the governor. The House passed a much less prescriptive bill just a couple of weeks ago. On the vote was in the low 70s, and so Suzanne knows, and even Terrell has followed the legislature for many years. It takes 84 votes to overturn a governor's veto in the House, 84 in the House, and so that indicates some tepid support for this, because I think, the bill said that a parent could opt their child out of any activity or coursework that the parent or guardian felt conflicted with their sincerely held beliefs, and that the student's academic record could not suffer for the parent withdrawing them. And, there's certainly, that is actually something that happens pretty much every day in public schools, and I imagine probably at the independent school as well. If a parent is not comfortable with a certain book or a certain lesson, they can ask for their child to have an alternative lesson or an alternative book, for instance. And in the public schools, the school boards have policies that have that all lined out. You know, if you have a concern, you go to the teacher. If the teacher doesn't help you in the way that you think you should be, you know, then you go to the principal, that type of thing. But in I would say 99% of the cases, you know, the parent says, hey, you know, I really don't want my kid reading The Color Purple. So the teacher says, okay, read this book instead and do the essay on that instead. And all is well. But the way this bill was written, it was so broadly structured that if you had a child who was failing, say, senior English, well, that's a graduation requirement. The way the bill's written, they could withdraw their child from senior English, say, in January, and the child's academic record couldn't reflect that. And then, so here how does the school make sure that the kid graduates from high school? I mean, obviously there should be some responsibilities on the parents for that as well. But it was just the way it was written. Again, it's kind of a one size fits all kind of thing. And, you know, it's attempting, I think the bill sponsor said it's an attempt to codify in law parental rights. Well, that is actually already in state law, that parents have the moral and educational right over the upbringing of their child. And you know, the school boards agree with that. It may come as a surprise to some people, but most school board members are parents or grandparents or, you know, aunts or uncles. And so, you know, we have that parental perspective, and you have parents in the school every day helping out in the classroom, serving on the PTO. You know, they might be a paraprofessional or a lunch person. And so there is a lot of parental involvement and parental give and take. Parents, you know, you might hear from a lot of parents, I already know what my kid is doing in class because I'm getting these Power School notifications every 2 hours, you know, because they haven't done their homework, right, Terrell? You probably have a similar thing at Independent. So just saying that it's, you know, parents have rights. We welcome parents into the schools, but when you write a bill that broadly, it ends up hurting kids.
What's striking to me this year on that, if we can stay on parental rights for just a second, is that last year it was very clear. We called it the Parental Bill of Rights, and those were sort of happening all over the country. That got vetoed. This year there are, you know, sort of parental Bill of Rights-esque things being added to other completely unrelated bills. So it's a really interesting tactic, I think, that some of the conservative lawmakers are trying this year. For instance, in that open enrollment law that's already in effect that I mentioned earlier, there was a little tweak to that law earlier this session where they wanted to make sure that the children of teachers in that district would still have the ability for their children to attend the schools where they teach. For instance, if I live in Wichita but teach in Mays right now, the Mays district might allow my children to go to the school where I teach. That wasn't written in the law originally, so they changed it. But during a hearing, during debate on that law, Representative Susan Estes, who's on the K-12 Education Budget Committee, inserted a requirement for school districts to have a parent portal on their website, a clear Parents' Bill of Rights measure that was just added to that bill. So I think that that's really interesting, and those are happening in other unrelated bills this year.
Yeah, that's definitely, it's something that we also see nationwide. There's still an interest in that. Can I just say, coming back to that open enrollment provision, you know, KSB testified against the open enrollment bill last year, and it probably sounds like, oh, what's your problem? Why don't you want kids to go to school wherever they want to? Well, we testified against open enrollment because I think it's 95% of the public schools in Kansas already have a voluntary open enrollment policy at their school. They say, hey, if you have a kid and you think, oh, you know, the Andover school district is not providing this program for my kid, but Wichita is, I should be able to send my kid to Wichita. Well, 259 would say, oh, well, you know, we do happen to have spot in that elementary school, so sure, come on over. And you know, so most of that again, it was more than 90% of the schools in Kansas already had that. You know, they have policies in place, and so this was kind of a solution in search of a problem. And then it was made very, very prescriptive by, you know, you have to figure out your enrollment capacity, you have to go every single school, every single building, every single grade level. In a district like Wichita, state's largest district, how many buildings do they have? That's a heck of a big job. Now, if you're out in Otis Bison or in Healy, where there's 38 kids in Healy in the whole school district, not a big problem. But, again, it was kind of a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. And so it's it's sort of adding just more paperwork and more angst to a situation that really doesn't need to be that way.
Does it go the other way, though, to some of the school districts, like a family might move to Mays or to Andover on purpose so that their child can go into that school district? Is it currently available that you could just say, well, I'd rather my kid go to Andover?
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding your question.
Like you said that you could choose, like what am I trying to say? The open enrollment. Thank you. That you could, someone in Andover could say, oh, there's this program at USD 259. Can we go the other direction with that? We could, yeah.
So could a parent in Wichita request that their child attend a school in Andover, for instance,
or one of the school districts
Mays,
that tend to be where they would move in order to, go to a better school district.
If the district has a policy in place to accept kids. Now, in some cases, I believe Andover is one of them. If you have, especially in the case of, say, Andover and some of the other high-growth districts, their taxpayers have told their school board, we're paying higher taxes to support the Andover Public Schools or the Johnson County Public Schools or the USD 383 Manhattan Schools, which is where I'm from, and I was on the board for 8 years. And so, those districts might say, well, we would rather you board not accept outside kids because we're paying the property taxes to support the schools that serve our children who live in Andover. So it's a local control issue.
One other thing to note is you may set the way the law is written now that goes into effect next year, you can send your child to that school, but you have to transport them. So it does not include any kind of transportation costs. So, part of the argument against that was, well, then you're only going to get the kids who have a parent who can drive them every day from, East Wichita into Andover or West Wichita into Mays or Goddard. So that's an issue too.
So we kind of went down a tangent there. But
that was
Leah,
my fault.
I know that we were going to get into the school vouchers issue.
Yeah.
Do you want to share what happened today?
So today there was a vote on a bill. It's called Senate Bill 83. It's a bill that would have given education. It is still in existence. So let me repeat that. It gives education savings accounts of about $5,000, which is the base state aid, to any student who wishes to attend a private school, a non-public school, and when they say non-public school, that's a term to refer to, say, a homeschool. Or there's been a lot of talk this session and especially today during the floor debate about micro schools. So if I wanted to just set up a school over here in the corner and have 5 kids, and I could do that. Doesn't matter if I have a teaching license. Doesn't matter if I can do math, and I'll tell you, you don't want me teaching your kids math. And you could take that money, and that money comes out of the pot of money that pays for public schools, and it goes to these completely unregulated schools. So that was very unpopular with the members of the House of Representatives. They felt like, why should people pay property taxes to send other people's kids to private school? Or to really, I think there's a lot of concern about the fact that homeschools and micro schools are not regulated at all under this bill. A school like Independent has a lot of processes in place to ensure a good education for kids. But, a startup micro school in somebody's basement doesn't have there's no guarantee that the kids are going to get any kind of education. So that was very unpopular with the 125 members of the House. So, and this is a common tactic, so I'm not casting shade on anybody in particular, but what the legislative leadership did was they said, okay, so everybody hates this silly voucher bill, so we're going to put in a year of special education funding. We talked briefly about how special education is underfunded. So we're going to put it in a year of special ed funding, a little over $75 million. And we'll put in a provision that says, okay, Public schools, the court is requiring us to increase your funding this year under the Gannon school finance decision. Okay, we're going to do that. But if we're going to give that to you, you have to spend 50% of that Gannon increase on teacher salaries. Well, that doesn't sound too bad. In reality, schools spend about 85% of their funds on teacher salaries and on staff salaries. It's on salaries because schools are about people. Teachers, paraprofessionals, bus drivers, lunch ladies, all those kinds of folks. So what ends up happening is, this sounds great. Again, it's kind of a one-size-fits-all thing. But in some of the smaller schools, if they say they've been losing students over the past few years, so they're losing funds because they don't have kids enrolled in school. But then they have been able to give some teacher raises over the past couple of years because of some additional funding that's come in through the federal government because of COVID and some of the increased Gannon funding that's begun trickling in. If they have to now use 50% of their Gannon funding on teacher raises, then teachers are the only ones who get a raise. The paraprofessional who makes the classroom a better place doesn't get a raise. The bus driver doesn't get a raise. The school librarian doesn't get a raise. And so the school districts and even the teachers unions are saying no to this bill. So it's been a hot debate. This tactic is called bundling. It's sort of the spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down. So you need to have 84 votes to override a gubernatorial veto. The governor has said, I will veto any voucher bill that comes my way, education savings account voucher. So what I think leadership wanted to see today was probably 75, 80, 82 yes votes so that they can twist some more arms and then overnight, and then there's a final action vote tomorrow when it really counts and people's names get written down. So the bill passed today by a very narrow margin of 61 yes to 59 no. I mean, that's actually a defeat. As far as leadership is concerned, there were 2 Democrats who were absent, and so I think you can count on them. Probably if they're there tomorrow, they will be no votes. So that was surprising. I think most folks thought that there would probably be about maybe 8 or 9, maybe 10 more yes votes than there were, except for, and Suzanne knows my colleague Scott Rothschild, he said 62. So he was right. So he needs to go buy a lottery ticket. So that was a real shocker this afternoon, and it really shows that Kansans value their public schools, and they have let their legislators know that they don't want to pair a voucher that takes money away from public schools and would do permanent long-term damage as it's phased in over 5 years. They oppose that, and they don't want that to be paired with a temporary increase in special education funding and a temporary teacher pay raise that won't even work for every school district.
Thank you. Suzanne, before we move on from school vouchers, is there anything that you would like to add about where the proponents are coming from, or what, on either side of the issue,
right? What
else kind of hasn't been said?
Well, the first thing is no one can agree at what the definition of voucher is. So there's been much consternation on each side of whether, what constitutes a voucher. Don't call this a voucher bill. It's not a voucher bill. It's an education savings account bill, or it's a tax credit scholarship bill. I think the general public, essentially, when you say voucher, what we're talking about is tax money going toward private schools. That's, I think, a general understanding. Now, there are a lot of different ways to do that, and there are a lot still alive in the legislature today. Tax credit scholarships, for instance, would be as an individual or a business or an organization could donate money to a scholarship granting organization up to $500,000 as the law is currently written, to help a low-income student attend a private school, pay for private school tuition. Terrell, you testified in favor of that program. It's been in place since 2014. It was designed to, initially written, low-income kids in the 100 worst-performing schools in the state, I believe, right? So it was very narrow very pointed at essentially the argument was getting kids who couldn't otherwise afford it out of failing schools. That's the argument. And it's been it has some students have done that. What the legislators this year are trying to do is expand that greatly, basically making it raising the income qualifications up to a family of four, the way one of the amendments is written now, 6 times the federal poverty level. So you could make $180,000 a year and qualify for this program. So not exactly the same. And then there's also the education savings account that Leah mentioned. But I would like to hear your take on the education. I mean, on the tax credit scholarships, because you have had students attend independent with those, correct?
Correct. We went from 2 students prior to me being there to 31 students on the tax credit program. GPAs, they improved their GPAs by 0.4% for those in upper school and 0.8% for those in middle school. So we've shown some great success for those kids who came to us. They didn't come with perfect GPAs. They didn't come with perfect attendance or perfect behavior, but they did come with a desire to want to learn, and their families committed to our school. And so we gave those kids the opportunity. As we look at the tax credit program, one of the things that we kind of leave out in terms of the public knowledge is that you've got to raise that money. And so it's not that the allocation of $10 million just automatically goes into the scholarship fund, but that money has to be raised. And the state has yet to raise the actual $10 million to even give out that many scholarships. And so that's one of the first things I think we've got to tweak, if you will, or address would be that is how do we get the money there for the right kids? Originally, you're right. It was for the lowest performing 100 schools. And I hate to use the term failing, because I was a public school turnaround principal, and I was sent to those quote unquote schools that were people say were failing. I would say we were struggling, but we weren't failing. But the reality is that public school, private school, whatever, we've got to look in the mirror and look at ourselves and find and really evaluate and hold ourselves accountable. Are we giving the best education for all of our kids? Yes, our kids come in with poverty issues. Yes, our kids come in with different issues. But what are we doing, even within the district? Are we putting the money where it's supposed to be? Are we making sure that the intervention dollars get to the most neediest kids? And if not, then how do we provide opportunities for those kids to have a better opportunity for an education? If I happen to live in a certain zip code, I could be, excuse my French, damned to be in a low-performing school in elementary, middle, and high. Now, that's not fair to that kid. That's not fair to that family. And if we are not going to, quote-unquote, come in and fix or cultivate or transform the school, then we've got to at least give that kid an opportunity to have a chance to be successful. We can't just leave that kid in there. And most of the people who are making the decisions, we don't live in those zip codes. We don't go to those schools. Our kids don't go to those schools. And it's easy for us to take the quote-unquote moral high road and say what we should be doing when our kids are going to Mays and Andover and they are in successful schools, but the kid who lives in 67214 happens to have to go to school that has not met whether it was AYP under No Child Left Behind or any other of the standards in terms of excellence. How do we address that? And how do we look at ourselves in the mirror and say, for a school that is in that zip code that has been struggling for year after year after year, do we say, well, we're going to give it another 5 years? We're going to allow another generation to fail. And when we track those kids, we already know where those kids end up in, usually in low-performing jobs or low-paying jobs or incarcerated or in the cemetery prematurely. So if we know the data's there and we know the reading scores dictate some of the prison populations, we've got to do something different. I'm not saying that public education is failing. Not my heart. I still love public education. I am saying we've got to look in the mirror and do something. We've got to tweak it. We've got to transform it. We've got to do something. And I'm not saying a full-blown voucher system is the way to go. But we've got to give kids an opportunity, which is what I think the tax credit did. It gave kids an opportunity for families who wanted that to have at least a chance to get my kid into a better educational setting.
Now, the danger there, of course, that opponents say is that anytime you target money to any kind of private school or homeschool, non-public school, that's less money going to the public school system that's already struggling, that already, we're looking at COVID money, a windfall essentially of COVID money that has been a blessing to schools to try and attack those learning gaps is going to end. It's going to sunset next year. They're already panicking about that, what they're going to do about that. The question is, and the debate every day in the legislature is, are private schools or homeschools necessarily the answer for some of these kids, or do we need to improve somehow, really attack and improve public schools in a better way? And then you get into the whole matter of accountability and how you measure that. And that's a whole nother topic that I'm sure we can talk about forever.
Yeah, and I think the answer is yes and. Yes, private schools are the answer for some, but there's also some other answers in terms of really focusing on those schools. When we look at the fact of our local school got approximately $300 million infused in it, we should see some academic growth of all kids. $300 million would allow us, or did allow us, if you will, to come up with every intervention under the sun to put in place. And so if we don't see those interventions, if we don't see those improvements, then we can't blame anyone else. I'm at a school that we got ESSER dollars, we didn't get Ian's dollars. So the last two, quote unquote, pots of money, the independent school didn't get anything. Yet those schools, kids were able to come to our school and we were able to show some success without the money. What could we have done if we had the money? Even more. How many more kids could we have helped if we had the money? And so that's where I think the accountability piece comes in, that is, with the infusing of money, what did we do with the money? If we just built new schools or put air conditioners up, then we failed our kids. Because, yes, they're cooler, if you will, but they can't read. And we've got to deal with the fact of the bottom line, academically, where are those kids at, and what did we do with the dollars?
Leah, I want you to jump in here, and maybe you can add something about when we're talking about metrics and what are we measuring, how are we showing success or not showing success as a result of the different laws that end up passed. Where do you come down on that?
I appreciate Terrell, and we've known each other for many years. He's a good man. So we're just on a different, we're on opposite sides of this particular issue, but not. Yeah, it is. It is. So, we've had basically a decade of underfunding of public schools by the legislature. That funding was only starting to come in. And what happens in March of 2020, just 3 years ago, boom, worldwide health crisis. So that set everybody back, public schools and private schools. COVID school was no fun for anybody, and we all have talked about already that there are gaps that exist and they need to be addressed. So the money was only beginning to trickle in. It is still only beginning to trickle in. So that's a big part of it. And then, people say, oh, well, your test scores. Well, that's true. A lot of test scores are driven by poverty. But what they don't talk about is that our high school graduation rates in Kansas are at an all-time high, including for special education kids, including for kids on free lunch. So those are the very poorest kids, and including special education kids. We have post-secondary success. Terrell, we talked about, preparing kids for after high school, whether it be 2-year, 4-year, the job market. Public schools are doing a great job, making sure that we're not just saying, okay, kids, everybody has to sit in a classroom for 8 hours a day, and then you all have to go on to college whether you want to or not. There's really more of that focus on personalized education, as Terrell was talking about. So there is so much more to a child than a test score. And, to say that, because a kid showed up on, March 15th to take the math test and, maybe they didn't sleep well last night because, somebody in the house got arrested or, they didn't eat well, to say that, a kid and their school should be judged on one test score is really not, it's not legit.
What I think I might be hearing is that the public schools haven't had enough time yet.
Yes.
Is that kind of the...
But, we will say, yes, we always need to do better.
And have we had enough time? And again, I think Leah's right. We're great friends. I love Leah. Everything I know, she told me. When it comes down to this issue of a test score, she's absolutely right. We shouldn't judge a school or judge a kid by a test score. I've always advocated for a growth model. My problem is I'm not hearing a growth model or even a growth in the system. And so even with $300 million infused, where is the growth? And if we say it's graduation rate, then did we adjust the system to make the numbers fit what we want? meaning that we extend the semester. So if we did, if the kid in Andover has 18 weeks to get a credit, but the kid in the urban school has 21 weeks, well, that kid really didn't do the same work in the same amount of time. And we can't now compare apples to apples because Suzanne had 18 weeks and Leah had 21 weeks.
But if it takes me 2 hours to do my homework, but it takes you 1 hour to do your homework, we both did our homework still.
And if we go in with that mentality, at some point we got to deal with this have and have not system. And I think we've proven a have and have not system will always leave out people of poverty and people of color. And that's what we've done now with the system. We say, okay, for districts that happen to be quote unquote all white, it is your test score. And that shows that you're being successful. Great. Andover, you're great. Goddard, you're great. For schools that have poverty or kids of color, Wichita, Topeka, KCK, we're saying it's not your test score. We need another measure. Well, as an African American, I'm offended by that. An African American from Tulsa, Oklahoma, who went to the best high school in Tulsa, who is historically has been a black school that integrated. We were taught we were the best of the best. And with that, my test score was just as good as a kid in Jeans or any other suburb. And so at some point, we've got to look at the fact that, again, as a system, have we watered down the expectations of our kids, and now they're living up to those low expectations?
But, I think, when we talk about expectations, I mean, I think, what is it? I think there's 21 credits required to graduate from high school in Kansas. Most public schools require 24 or higher. So I would say we haven't lowered expectations. I would also say the have and have nots thing is something that we worry about all the time, because if you funnel out, let's say, all the middle and upper class kids who have parents who can afford to drive them across the county to a private school or to a different school, who is in the, so then we have and have nots. The only kids who are left in public schools are the special ed kids, the kids who don't speak English, the poor kids, the kids who don't have anybody to help them go over here to the more well-to-do schools who will accept them. So should the state be subsidizing a have and have not system? And we'd say no.
I want to see if I can boil down the point that you're making, Terrell, to something, or if you can fill in the blank there for me. If I tried to kind of boil down what Leah was saying, and it felt like it was, the public school system needs more time to bring itself up to this level. What would you say is the essence of what's going on that's wrong with the public school system?
That's a tough question, and we're on the air and everything else.
Tell us.
I do live in Wichita. I think one is an expectation thing. I really do believe, and I think since we're here in Wichita, I think we have to wrestle with what is the true expectation of the Wichita Public Schools and its graduates, and really be honest about that and deal with the fact of we have lowered those expectations. And then deal with the fact of we've allowed an outside enemy to come and make it private versus public. My 5 years in central office, last 4, I dealt with our enrollment piece. The reality is it's not private versus public. Our kids went to the suburbs. No one wants to talk about that. No one wants to talk about the fact that Andover built all their new buildings off of Wichita Public School kids. Same thing with Mays. But it's easy to look at Independent, is collegiate, Trinity, where we grew by 20 kids and missed the fact that Andover grew by 200 kids. And they came from Wichita. And then look at why are folks fleeing Wichita to go to Andover, and what can we do differently in Wichita to hold those individuals and want them to want to be here in Wichita and provide that education that they can get here in Wichita.
We have several other things to talk about, but Suzanne, why don't you wrap us up?
I'll keep it real quick, but that's interesting because that flight to the suburbs has been happening at least as long as I've lived here. Since 1990, we've been writing about, people fleeing to the suburbs. One thing I wanted to note, though, Wichita the Wichita district has been trying to use its ESSER funds, its COVID relief funding, for these expanded programs, expanded school year, really, really pumped a lot of money into summer school. And thousands and thousands of kids based on their test scores qualified for summer school. A fraction of them, I think 16%, attended. So, I mean, it's like the schools can have the programs, if the families aren't getting them there, it's a real challenge. And I mean, I think you're both right.
Oh man, we could just keep talking about this, you guys. Because what's causing that? Because they can be bused. They're fed breakfast. They're fed lunch. They're given,
It wasn't required. It wasn't part of, like, they're not going to, it was just an enrichment program.
Yeah.
So
Interesting. Okay. Oh my goodness. Well, we're going to run out of time if we keep on like this. I do have a quick audience question that I want to tuck in here, and then I want to move into some of this other legislation that's being discussed. Carl asks, Carl wants clarification. It was said that Kansas schools are now fully funded, but special ed is not. How does that work? Who got more? What was, Leah, can you, or Suzanne?
I'll start and then others can chip in.
you explain it every day.
Right. Okay. So when we say that public schools are fully funded, that is the regular education classroom. So that's the Gannon school finance case that you've heard about for years, and that's what you hear the governor saying when she says, I have fully funded schools, or a candidate would say, I will fully fund public schools if I'm elected governor. The challenge is that special education is a separate pot of money, and it's appropriated separately. The legislature passed a law in 2011 that said, okay, we know that special education students, and in Kansas, not only are children with disabilities eligible for special education services, but also gifted students are available. So that's not the case in every state, but in Kansas, gifted students and students with disabilities are legally entitled to receive special ed services. So special ed is the additional cost of educating students with disabilities and gifted students above what it takes to keep everybody in a general education classroom going in the direction they're going to go. So the state said, okay, if the federal government will provide 40% reimbursement for the excess costs above what it takes to educate those kids in general ed, we will provide then 92% of the statewide average of the remaining excess cost. The problem is the feds haven't done their duty either. I think if we're lucky, we'll see the feds get about 15% kicked back to Kansas schools. Terrell and I have been on many visits to D.C., and they always say, oh, that's a really hard nut to crack. So how about those, Wildcats or those, Jayhawks, right? So, and this year it was like, oh yeah, well, maybe you'll get a 1% increase. So what we see is that the state, we had some budgetary issues, that we had some change in leadership in the legislature that became much more averse to spending money. And so the state hasn't funded its 92% for many, many years. And, that keeps digging the hole deeper. Yeah, it diverts. So if you have a child who has disabilities or is gifted, that's a legal mandate on the school district to provide those services. If we don't provide those, then the child's parents can sue.
And is it not a legal mandate at the federal level as well?
Yeah, the special education is overseen by federal law.
Right, but then how do they not go ahead?
Yeah, well, they just said, go ahead. You want to add?
Well,
I don't want to.
You've heard the term
Take all
unfunded mandate?
Yeah, unfunded mandate. Yeah.
Okay.
That's exactly what that is.
So because it's a legal mandate, if I have a kid who is a special education kid and they need services, but I'm not being reimbursed for the correct amount, I have to pull that money out of the general education budget because I have to provide that to that special education kid, whether they be a kid with disabilities or gifted, or I'm breaking the law.
Wow. That was fascinating. Okay, good question, audience member Carl. Let's dig. We have several other big issues to discuss here, and I'm a little nervous to get into this because we're going to need another 2 hours here. But I want to dig in a little bit to issues of transgender legislation, and just sort of start with overview and updates on what's going on there. Leah, do you want to start there? Or I know Suzanne has been paying a lot of attention to it as well.
Yeah, I can do it. The bill that just passed, it was House Bill 2238 that people are calling it. Well, it's the Fairness in Women's Sports Act is the official name of it. It's known as the trans sports bill. This that passed both houses. It passed both houses last year and was vetoed by a very narrow margin, 3 votes, I think. They were 3 votes shy of overriding the veto. So this year, it's passed. There's going to be some arm twisting for sure. It would prevent, basically it would limit girls' sports to biological females. These are, Leah mentioned that a lot of the issues, the top hot button issues this year are social issues, they're culture war issues, and this is very case in point. Other measures that are still alive, I believe, in the legislature are one that would block doctors from any kind of gender identification surgery on minors, and then another that would define female as a biological female with female reproductive parts. But the one that affects schools is the trans sports bill, and Keisha, has rules about transgender athletes and has testified as such. Again, this is one of those culture war issues that it has a lot of support in the State House.
Terrell, I want to come to you on that issue. How do you see this legislation impacting life in your school? If it passes, if it doesn't pass, what would you hear from parents? What's the feeling on the ground?
And we would adhere to Keisha, and that's our stance on that, both public and private, in terms of whatever the Keisha rule is what we adhere to. I will say that.
Can you describe for the audience what Keisha is?
What Keisha is the Kansas State High School Athletics and Activities Association. And so they're the organization that governs, if you will, athletics and activities for high school and middle school sports. And so they have their rules already outlined in terms of a kid changing gender, if you will, and how they must declare that. They can do that one time during their high school experience, if you will, and then that becomes that gender until they graduate. My thing is whether they vote for or against, I think people need to understand we're still talking about kids. And at the independent school, we did not have a kid who was transgender, but many of the schools that we played against thought we did. And the statements they made about that young lady were absolutely offensive. And I had to share with several people online, I don't care one way or the other. She's a kid, and we need to treat her as a kid. And you can feel strong against this, whatever case may be, but that's still a kid. And we need to watch how we talk about kids, how we treat kids, and every kid deserves to be loved. Every kid deserves to be cherished and deserves to be protected. And we can debate whatever we want to debate as adults, but we shouldn't be yelling at kids. We shouldn't be calling them names. We shouldn't be holding up signs. We shouldn't be posting things about kids. And that's where my heart is in this subject, is making sure that we're protecting kids. And that's all kids, public school, private school, they're kids. And we need to make sure that we deal with that as them being kids.
Leah, did you want to add?
Well said, Terrell. Thanks for saying that. KSB's stance on the bill was similar to what Terrell just said. Keisha already has processes in place, and so KASB, the school boards, believe that we should let Keisha handle it, that the legislature doesn't need to get involved, and that the processes are already in place. And, if people don't know, Keisha is made up of principals, athletic directors, coaches, school board members. It's a large organization that really does the work day to day of those high school activities and athletics. And so they're the ones who are in the trenches. It's kind of like, I wouldn't tell Terrell how to teach first grade art, if I weren't a teacher. Kind of the same thing. We don't think we should be telling Keisha what to do when they already have the expertise. And something that some legislators have said to me over the past couple of weeks is, none of the schools in my legislative district have asked for this. This is part of a national kind of narrative, and it's really not anything that Kansas schools have asked for, whether they be private or public. And so, but people, it is a very hot button issue, and I think they fear for their political career if they don't vote for it, and that's why you see what you see. And I think this is the third year for this type of bill.
It sounds more like it's a political rallying cry than something that actually would do something. That's very interesting. Okay. Well, I want to come back around to, actually, before I come off of that topic, Suzanne, I want you to weigh in as well. Just if there's anything on that subject that you think people don't understand or that they need to know? Is there a disconnect? I think we uncovered a pretty good one there, but like, are there additional disconnects you think between perception?
There's a lot of, and I'm not going to speak on the trans bill necessarily, but just these education bills in general. I think what's been really interesting to me to watch and to listen to is just the disconnect in understanding of the way schools work. I mean, you have a lot of people who are sort of testifying on any number of measures without very much connection to schools. They might not, have any experience in public schools. So a lot of these, for instance, these parental, when the Parents' Bill of Rights measures come up, inevitably you have people say, gosh, yeah, that sounds completely reasonable. Of course, parents should know what their kids are learning. We should know what books are in the library. We should know, all of that stuff already exists. So, and that's the arguments against these measures is always like, we have, we have the parent portal. We have, you can check your kids' grades every 5 minutes if you want to in Wichita Public Schools. I know my kids went to Wichita Public Schools and I drove them crazy by checking their grades all the time. But yeah, so there is a huge disconnect there. There's also a huge, debate going on about just bundling policy with funding. So really, the K-12 Education Budget Committee, for instance, has really, Christy Williams heads that committee and has made it, basically, it has said as such, we have the purse strings and we want to connect policy with those. We're funding schools, and so we want to make sure that schools are operating the way we want, and that includes policy measures. So that's been really interesting, too.
Terrell, what about you? If we step back just broadly looking at education and legislation relating to it, where do you think there's a disconnect between what people understand about it and what's really happening that we haven't talked about yet?
I think the disconnect is just the average person, I think, in Topeka hasn't been on a school campus. And so they're making legislative decisions about schools and have not spent time on campuses to see how schools are run or what is the culture of schools today. And so I think we can get more legislators in schools to meet kids, to meet teachers, to meet parents in a natural environment. I think we could get better legislation out of everyone across the board.
Okay, last question that I want each of you to answer as well is just what can you think of that people can do, just average people, what can they do to help our community to better support and educate our children? Go ahead, Suzanne.
That's a $10 million question or a $5 billion question. I think one easy way is just to get involved in your schools. You don't have to have a kid in schools. I don't anymore. I have adult children. But there are all sorts of volunteer programs available. There's one I really believe in called Read to Succeed. It's once a week you go and read to a third grader, and it really that week, that hour a week, you'd be surprised at how much you learn about how schools operate, and just the atmosphere and getting into the schools is just really helpful to give you that kind of perspective. The other thing is to get engaged with your local representatives. If you feel strongly about something, you have senators and representatives in Topeka that need to hear from you, no matter which side of the coin you are on. So write to them, call them. That you should be voicing your opinions to them.
Terrell, what do you think?
So I'm not going to echo what you said, but absolutely. Yeah, absolutely what she said. I guess I'll give you two other things. One, to make sure that you're participating in local elections and making sure that your school board is representative of your community. The second thing is kind of a twofold, is give money. Give money both to school debt in terms of lunch debt for students, but also to SGOs, scholarship granting organizations, to give low-income kids an opportunity to have exposure to a different education. But also there's many kids in the public school who have debt because of school lunches. You can give to that effort as well, but it just helps kids.
So I'll agree with what Suzanne said, and Terrell said, vote in your local elections. Again, go to your school, maybe just go in and ask the principal, I would like to volunteer. What do you need help with? Maybe they just need somebody to help run the copy machine or cut out, stuff for the bulletin boards. And that is a great way. Another thing you can do if you're, a true nerd like Suzanne and Terrell and I, you can also watch live YouTube videos. You can see me get lectured for calling things vouchers. That was fun. Live on YouTube. You go to the Kansas Legislature's website, which is kslegislature.org, and there's some links at the top, and you can watch the House and Senate floor debates. You can watch all of the committee meetings in real time. And if you have better things to do with your day during your work day, go back and watch them because they record them. So you can watch over and over when I get yelled at for calling a voucher. Were you there for that day? Yeah. He was in the back nodding. No, he wasn't. So that's a great way because it's free. You don't have to sign up for anything. You just have to spend a little bit of time and watch what's happening.
Maybe if you're having trouble sleeping.
Yes, yeah.
You want to maybe learn something, but then it's okay. You might nod off. It might help you in multiple ways. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for that very interesting conversation. Let's have a round of applause for our panel. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Do check out the library's resource guide for more on this topic, and you can also find the recording of this and other Engage ICT discussions at engageict.org to share with friends and family. For KMUW, I'm Sarah Jane Crespo. Good night.